Hi, welcome. I'm Michelle Gullion. I'm the Director of Collections and Research here at the National First Ladies Library. And today we're doing Talk with a Curator, and we're going to be looking at a letter that was written to Florence Harding when she was First Lady by Carrie Jacobs Bond. Now, who's Carrie Jacobs Bond, you may be wondering? Well, 100 years ago, you would have known who Carrie Jacobs Bond was because you would probably been singing her songs, such as Just a Wearin' for You and I Love You Truly, or one of Florence's favorite songs, The End of a Perfect Day. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these letters that were written, Mrs. Bond, and then Florence responds to Mrs. Bond. We'll also be looking at some sheet music that Mrs. Bond wrote, and delving into her life a little bit more too. Florence and Carrie were definitely contemporaries, and they have so many things that are very, very similar to how they lived their lives, even though their lives went in different directions. It's so neat to listen to and to understand how these two women had so much in common, and that this letter and all of this brings these two together at this moment in time in the 1920s. We're going to start with Florence Harding, one of my favorite First Ladies. Florence was born August 15th, 1860 in Marion, Ohio. She was born Florence Kling, and she studied classical piano for many years in Marion. In 1877, after school, she attended the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, and she later stated that her intention in going to the Cincinnati Conservatory was to become an internationally recognized concert pianist. However, her father ended this intention of hers. He felt that this was not a good investment for him to do for his daughter. So unfortunately, when Florence was 19 years old, she eloped with Henry, or Pete DeWolf, he was known as Pete, and quickly gave birth to a son, and his name was Eugene Marshall DeWolf on September 22nd, 1880. By 1882, Pete DeWolf had abandoned Florence and her son Marshall, and Florence had to go back to Marion and start her life anew. She was finally granted a divorce, which was very, very difficult to do in those days, in 1886 on the grounds of gross neglect of duty. She resumed her maiden name. She took Kling back as her maiden name, and she became a single mother. She made a living by giving piano lessons to students there in Marion, Ohio. However, she wasn't able to really support her son Marshall, so Florence's parents kind of took over the raising of him and actually changed his last name from DeWolf to Kling. So there was a lot of tension there going on. But better days were coming to Florence. In 1891, she married Warren G. Harding in Marion, Ohio. Shortly after they got married, Warren became very ill, and Florence took over the Marion Star, which is the local newspaper there in Ohio, in Marion, and she took over as the business manager. And she never really left. She did lots of really amazing things, turned this into a flourishing, very successful newspaper. She hired newspaper boys to deliver the newspapers, and she really loved all of the hustle and bustle. She loved knowing about all the things that were happening locally in the town and nationally and internationally. That's actually what brings her and Warren Harding into politics. She loved politics. She thought that was really neat. But Warren Harding, as he's the editor and owner of the Marion Star, these politicians begin talking to him, and he gets involved in politics through that way. And of course, Florence is really, really encouraging him to do this. She's really thrilled. That's how he ends up running for the Senate, and he becomes a senator in 1914. And they move to Washington, D.C. then in 1914. Unfortunately, at that same time, Florence's son, Marshall DeWolf, dies January 1st, 1915, from alcohol-related illness. So I think that she saw Washington as kind of a new start to start her life a little bit on better grounds. She was an active suffragist, and she really was very keen on women getting the right to vote, so no one was more excited. In 1920, during the presidential campaign, women have the right to vote for the very first time, and she not only gets to work with her husband behind the scenes as he's running for president of the United States in 1920, but she's able to stand right next to him on the campaign porch as he does his campaign during the election. She considered the front porch campaign of 1920 to be the highlight of her life. She absolutely loved it. And she was not only the first lady who could openly campaign next to her husband, but she was also the first lady who was able to vote for her husband. And she was extremely proud of that. Now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about Carrie Jacobs Bond, who was an amazing woman herself. And there's a lot of similarities between her and Florence. She was born on August 11th, 1862. And she was born in Janesville, Wisconsin, and to a musical family. And she was just naturally musical. She could play music by ear from a very, very early age. She took music lessons until the death of her father, and then her family became quite destitute. She, like Florence, married at age 18 to E.J. Smith, and they had a son, and his name was Frederick. This marriage also ended in divorce, and it left her a single mother to support her son. She very quickly, though, turned her life around when she met Dr. Frank Lewis Bond, and they married in 1887, and they moved to Iron City, Michigan. This was a very happy time for Carrie. Dr. Bond shared her love of music, and he encouraged her to write and play her own arrangements. And he just really thought she was extremely talented. And during those 7 years, that's when she wrote her very first musical manuscripts. In 1897 was a huge year for her. It was the very first song of hers that was published. It was called Mother's Cradle Song. And unfortunately, that same year, Dr. Bond died from injuries sustained in an accident. When he died, she was 33 years old with a young son to support. So she moved from Iron City, Michigan to Chicago so she could be closer to the music publishing business that was thriving there. But when she got there, the male publishers were very picky, brushed her off quite a bit. She was becoming more and more destitute, so she decided she was going to establish her own publishing business. So that meant that the sales of her sheet music, she owned every note and every word of everything she wrote, which was virtually unheard of in her day, especially for a woman. She became the first female composer to earn $1 million. Her son, Fred, by this point he's grown up, he helps her run her publishing business, and they name it the Bond Shop. She drew the artwork for her sheet music covers. She did everything for them. So if you look at this picture that we're showing you now from the Library of Congress, it's a songbook called The Smile Songs. And there's all these little songs such as Smile a Little and Why, and you're going to see the beautiful little artwork that she did. They're lovely. The Wild Rose, however, became her trademark artwork and appears on many of her publications. Her first major hit was Just a Wearin' for You, and it became a parlor music hit in the days when sheet music arranged for the piano or how most people heard their music. So this song sold more than 2 million copies of sheet music. And if you look here, we have our own copy of it. Whoops, it's right here. Here's Just a Wearian for You. And look at this. This is her Wild Rose. You see that a lot. That becomes her trademark right there. By this point, Carrie is not only publishing, but she's traveling and she's performing her songs and she's singing her songs, playing the piano for them. She goes around the country doing that. And she even goes she's invited to the White House in 1908, where she performs for President Theodore Roosevelt and First Lady Edith Roosevelt. Then when World War I comes along, she becomes extremely patriotic and active during this time. She actually goes to Europe and performs for the U.S. troops at the U.S. Army camps. And she writes lots and lots of music at this time. Her song, The End of a Perfect Day, became a World War I anthem. She composed many songs for the troops during the war and collaborated with other women. If you look at this piece here that we're showing you from the Library of Congress, this is called My Son, and it was the words and music are all by Carrie. But she also collaborated with Fanny Hodges Newman on We Are All Americans, and with Mary Norton Bradford in His Buttons Are Marked U.S. After the war and during the 1920 campaign, Florence Harding told reporters her favorite song was A Perfect Day. While she was in the White House, she would play this song on the piano for the White House staff, amongst many other songs. One of the seamstresses at the White House, Lillian Rogers Parks, wrote about how much the staff enjoyed Florence playing her pieces in the White House for them. And A Perfect Day was one that she liked to play quite a bit. So that brings us now to the letters, the letter that Mrs. Bond writes to Mrs. Harding on February 14th, 1921. My dear Mrs. Harding, I hope you will pardon me for taking this liberty, but my old friend, Honorable J.B. Showalter of Pennsylvania, is a candidate for appointment as 3rd or 4th Assistant Postmaster General and has asked me to write the President a word of endorsement for him. And I am taking the liberty of asking your assistance with your husband in my dear old friend's behalf, and may I add another word of grateful thanks to you for this great help your great interest in my little song has been. Devotedly yours, Carrie Jacobs Bond. And then below this, in her own handwriting, she writes, am having book of my songs bound for you, sending them soon, C.J.B. Then, on February 22nd, 1921, Florence writes her back. My dear Mrs. Bond, I have received your very courteous letter of February 14th relative to the candidacy of Honorable J.B. Showalter, and same has received Mr. Harding's attention. I hope sometime to have the opportunity and pleasure of greeting you personally. I am deeply grateful to you for your interest, and I am sure I shall find great pleasure in having the book of your songs, which you state you are having bound for me. Please know of my appreciation. Very sincerely, Mrs. Warren G. And then P.S. I am sorry to have to send you a typed letter, which is because First Ladies get tons of letters and they just can't handwrite all of them. And Florence got lots and lots of letters from people all over the world. So who was J.B. Showalter, who the two are talking about? We're going to talk about who this gentleman is. He was born in 1851 in Pennsylvania, and he had quite the career. He was a school teacher, and then he set his sights on natural gas and petroleum production in the 1870s. Then he studied medicine in New York, and after graduating, he returned to Pennsylvania and set up a practice there. And then he began his public service career later in the 1880s as a member of the Pennsylvania State House Representatives. In 1897, he was elected to fill a vacant seat of Congressman James Davidson in the U.S. House of Representatives and continued to serve until 1903. So that's really the end of his public service. As you can tell, he doesn't get the Postmaster General post that he was so hopeful to get. However, he went back to doing his normal petroleum and natural gas developments, and then he moved later on to Florida, where he was involved in land development down there. He passed away in Washington, D.C. on December 3rd, 1932. But what about Florence and Carrie? Did they ever meet? Well, yes, they did. Almost a year later, in the Chicago Tribune, in the Washington Society paper, we see that February 15th, 1922, it states that in Washington, D.C., February 7th, Mrs. Harding received a number of persons at the White House this afternoon by appointment. Mrs. Harding invited Mrs. Carrie Jacobs Bond to the White House last week to the musical following the Supreme Court dinner, and Mrs. Bond, who is the composer of A Perfect Day, gave several numbers to close the program. Mrs. Bond, who spent several days in Washington en route from her home to California to New York and was a guest at the Congressional Club Friday afternoon tea, is now in New York, preparatory to sailing Saturday on a Mediterranean voyage. So that was actually a very perfect day, wasn't it, for Florence? And she got to meet Mrs. Carrie Bond at last. The following year, in 1923, Florence and Warren Harding go on a cross-country trip to Alaska, where President Harding dies en route of heart failure on August 2nd, 1923, in San Francisco. The following year, Florence, after she comes back to Washington, D.C., she wants to stay there and live there, but she has kidney problems all of her life and returns with a vengeance. So she goes back to Marion, Ohio to be cared for by her doctor there, and that's where she dies on November 21st, 1924. But this is just the beginning of really Carrie Jacobs Bond's big, she just continues to have so much success. The third and final huge mega hit for Bond was I Love You Truly. And this was sung and played for weddings. It was just an incredibly popular song in the day. And it was actually being sung and recorded in the 1940s into the 1950s. Pat Boone even sang I Love You Truly. We actually have another one of that. We have I Love You Truly there with the artwork of the wild rose. And then we also have in here we have A Perfect Day, of course, by Carrie Jacobs Bond, which was Florence's favorite song. Carrie continued on, as I said. Her autobiography was The Roads of Melody, and she published that in 1927. And she also continued to publish books of children's poetry and other poetry books. By the early 1920s, Bond had become a national figure for both her songs and vocal talents and moved her publishing house to Hollywood, California. She was now a very famous composer of her day. As this picture we're showing you from the Library of Congress shows, with other composers, she's sitting there, and behind her is Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Clark. Mr. Clark was a well-known cornetist and also composer, and of course, right next to him is John Phillips Sousa, who we all know is the fabulous marches that he composed. In 1932, Carrie's son, Fred Jacob Smith, committed suicide, and that was quite devastating to her, but she continued on and wrote and published her music until her death on December 28, 1946. The Los Angeles City Council honored her as one of America's greatest women. one of the really cool things about where her resting place is, she's there in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. Her chamber is found in the Great Mausoleum's Court of Honor under the stained glass display of Da Vinci's The Last Supper. She was the second artist to be entombed there. The first was Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. And what I think is really wonderful is that her son, Fred Jacob Smith, is also interned with her. We hope that you've enjoyed our talk with a curator today. We hope we've helped make you a more perfect day for you. Thank you so much for joining me. Stay safe and be well.
When you come to the end of a perfect day, and you sit alone with your thoughts, while the chimes ring out with a carol gay, for the joy that the day has brought. Do you think what the end of a perfect day can mean to a tired heart? When the sun goes down with a flaming red, and the dear friends have to part. Well, this is the end of a perfect day, near the end of a journey too, but it leaves a thought that is big and strong, and a wish that is kind and true. For memory has painted this perfect day with colors that never fade, and we find at the end of a perfect